welcome everybody. We're hosting, well, I think you've all heard a snippet of the conversation about obviously the major events that are happening in the world right now. Today's webinar touches upon diversity from a very specific angle. And we're hosting this as a roundtable because I think the subject matter really warrants a sort of an open conversation rather than the formality of a webinar. And perhaps we could click to the next chart, please. And the next one, please. And really just to kick off today's webinar, I think all of you are familiar that Fidelio works with boards through composition, evaluation, and development. Our focus is building high-performing boards, and diversity is absolutely a key theme in that regard. If we click to the next chart, if we're looking at search, for example, some 58% of our placements were female in the last year, and 43% from a minority ethnic background. We're signatories to the FTSE Women Leaders Review and have been accredited by the government for the past or by the Hampton Alexander Review for the past 5 years for our contribution. And we've also become a signatory to the Declaration on Climate Change. And I just mention that because there is definitely an intersectionality between what we're seeing in terms of climate change response and diversity. And if we click to the next chart, please. But we also see very much in other aspects of our work, every evaluation is an exploration of diversity, and boards want to focus on the cognitive diversity that they have, but also how they oversee diversity. We've been conducting board level development D&I programs, both for publicly listed companies, but also increasingly for private equity as well, which I think is quite an interesting development. And finally, our Seat at the Table programme has made a significant contribution to both UK and international boardrooms in terms of diversity. So diversity is core to what we do. And I think for this audience, it's very clear, if we click to the next chart, please, that there are real imperatives and benefits from diversity, including the license to operate, access to capital, attracting and retaining talent, decision-making and innovation, and ultimately that flow through to valuation. And this is quite interesting also from a private equity perspective. We're seeing real analysis there, and we've quoted some McKinsey research, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, about the higher performance or the outperformance of more diverse leadership teams. So far, I think so well known. But if we just move to the next chart, please. Today, we'd like to focus on perhaps a perspective, an aspect of diversity that you may not have considered in detail. And I think partly last year, one of our board evaluations was for a large charity providing mobility to those who have limited access to mobility. And it really prompted us to think in a very clear way about the different dimensions of diversity. Following on from that, I had a conversation with a former colleague of mine from Volkswagen days, and Ian Eyston, who has a very illustrious track record as an HR director of some of the UK's largest companies, who's gone on, and I'll allow him to explain in his own words, to really focus on neurodiversity in the workspace. And that's the topic we'd like to explore with you today, and then perhaps also open up to a broader discussion of diversity and inclusion as well. But before I introduce Ian, perhaps a couple of poll questions for the audience. Firstly, are you discussing neurodiversity as part of your diversity conversation within your company? And I should say this is Ian's suggestion as the question. So if I could ask everybody perhaps just to click on that. And I'm going to wait for either Amy or Kate to share the results there, please. Do we have a response, Kate or Amy? There we go. Oh, well, that's interesting. That's I had actually probably expected more of a distinction, but 63% say no, 37% actually yes. This is part of the diversity discussion within the company. And then if we could move to the next question, please. And a second poll question: are you discussing neurodiversity as part of your diversity conversation within the boardroom? And again, if we could open that up. Oh, well, that's categoric. It's very seldom that things are quite as distinct as that. Thank you very much for that answer. Well, then I think today's discussion is very pertinent. So if we could move on to the next chart. I've asked Ian to talk through 3 questions. Firstly, just to take us through his what led him to. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a echo. Perhaps if everybody could please just go on mute if you're not. Thank you. What led him to focus on neurodiversity, the implications of his research for the workplace, and then perhaps we can come to the board specifically. So, Ian, welcome, and if we can move to the next chart, please. And if I can turn to you and ask you how, from your HR background, how did you initially come into contact with this as an important subject matter, which actually led you to undertake a PhD? So, Ian, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you everyone for giving me some of your time today, and good afternoon. It's a really interesting topic in my view, and I think my journey, I found the steps along the way quite interesting too, because as you say, I was a HR director for about 20 years in 3 very large UK organisations, both public sector and private sector. And I spent a lot of time within that time working on diversity and inclusion within those businesses, and actually felt like it was really making significant progress in those organisations on a number of different fields within the diversity agenda. So, potentially was not complacent, but was feeling confident that we were ahead of the crowd. And then I had some specific experiences that prompted me to challenge those assumptions. And in one organisation in particular, I had 2 employee disciplinary cases that came along very quickly after each other. And in both cases, the line management of the employees had decided to dismiss these employees for gross misconduct, and the employee had appealed it. And as HR director, I was hearing the kind of final appeal before we got them to leave the organization. And what I found in both cases was that the individuals were neurodiverse. And probably this was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And actually at that time, I might not have even used that word neurodiverse, because it wasn't a phrase that I was common with. In both these cases, there were actually people that were on the autistic spectrum. One used the term autistic, one used the term Asperger's, and we'll come back to language and terminology in a bit. But in both cases, it became very clear to me as I investigated why they were being dismissed. They had taken actions which the line manager found as insubordinate. They used language that was very abrupt and typically inappropriate in a UK workplace, and had done it in what was considered an inappropriate way, and that had led to a breakdown in communications. But in reality, it wasn't their fault, because they were absolutely operating in the way within their autistic capabilities that they felt was in the best interests of the company. The manager hadn't understood that and had misread the situation. But as a company, we hadn't done anything to train the manager or the colleagues to actually deal with that kind of situation. So ultimately, it was neither the employee nor the line manager's fault that there was this breakdown in communication, but it was actually the organization's fault. And that made me really start to think about autism as it was then, and then broader out into the rest of neurodiversity. And what I came to realize over a period of a year or two was that actually there are significant risks for organizations around this aspect of diversity that are much less well understood than the other aspects of diversity. There's quite a lack of knowledge and understanding, and but that is actually no excuse for organizations or for boards to not recognize that this is a risk factor. And in particular, one of the things that makes it challenging is that language around this subject is tricky, and even understanding and terminology is tricky. And, for example, there isn't a absolutely accepted definition of what neurodiversity absolutely covers. Gillian talked about cognitive diversity. I've mentioned autism. There are conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, all of which and others get included within this cognitively different way that some people in the human population operate. And as we think about that, we realize that there are things, that challenges for organizations that we need to deal with. And that prompted me to, as I was just starting my doctorate work at Cranfield University, and I knew I wanted to do something about diversity, but I hadn't chosen a specific subject. And that led me to focus over the last 5 years looking at neurodiversity in the workplace. And it's the insights that I've gained from those 5 years of interacting with case study organizations, the academic research, and my own research, interviewing a lot of autistic and neurodiverse people in the workplace and their line managers and their HR colleagues, that have led me to have now a much better understanding of neurodiversity than I had 5 or 6 years ago.
Thank you. And I think that's really interesting that, the starting point was two very similar cases, which I guess could have been perceived from two very different angles. And I guess you ended up looking from a different angle and bringing that understanding. So if we could move on, Ian, and just to the next chart, please. And really, you're 5 years later, you've conducted those interviews, you've conducted a lot of research, you've learned a lot, you've pushed around that sort of definition. What are your key findings with regard to the workplace?
Yes, well, thank you. And actually, I was going to start with a couple of findings that weren't from my research, but I actually picked up early on from other research, which was really important grounding for this. First came from a piece of research from an organization called Autistica, who work in this field. And they did quite a lot of research with the University College of London, and they found that one of the big challenges around neurodiversity is that the level of disclosure amongst neurodiverse people in the workplace, whether that be at interview stage or even once they're recruited, is much lower than all other aspects of diversity. So if you combine that with the fact that up until recently, diagnosis levels have also been pretty poor, what the implications of that piece of research is that there are many people in our organizations already who are neurodiverse who haven't told us that they are. And that brings with it a really interesting set of challenges for organizations to think about, and we can come back to that. The second piece of somebody else's research was from a lady called Dr. Anne Cockayne, who did her PhD in this subject, and she focused specifically on the line manager perspective of dealing with neurodiverse employees. And what she found quite significant, and actually I found it also subsequently in my research, was the level of line manager discomfort when they realized that they had someone that was neurodiverse in their team was significantly higher than having to deal with any other kind of diversity. And there's a considerable amount of stress being brought to line manager populations because they don't feel they have the understanding or the language or the tools or the support from their organization to actually deal with neurodiversity in the way that they've been trained for other aspects of diversity. So that is a very specific challenge. And then thirdly, if you look at my research, I found lots of things. And one of the dangers of today's talk is that there's a potential I might talk too much and not leave time for questions, because I found it fascinating how much I've learned. But for example, some of the things that I think are implications for the workforce are that because of that definition issue and the range of conditions, actually the complexity of dealing with neurodiversity is more challenging than other aspects of diversity. And also, there are probably more stereotypes, assumptions, and biases in people's perception than people realize, and that creates challenges. At the same time, however, there are massive talent opportunities, And a number of organizations that I've come across in my workforce have been able to adjust both their recruitment and their management of neurodiverse people to really tap into the absolute powers that these people bring in an organization where we are really struggling. The war for talent has moved to a whole new level, while actually being able to tap into, and quite a lot of neurodiverse people are underemployed or unemployed because they struggle with recruitment processes. So if you can find a way to get past that, there's a talent pool there that organizations can tap into. One or two specifics just to finish off in terms of this area that are really quite interesting, quite thought-provoking, is that, and I learned a lot about this, was, for example, the sensory issues that many neurodiverse people experience are considerably large and vast and complicated, and it's not just about bright lights or noise. It can be about textures, it can be about smells, it can be all sorts of things. I had some very vivid descriptions given to me by neurodiverse people, which as an employer you have to think really hard about how you might support those employees. There are also many potential mistakes that organizations, I would say most organizations, are making currently, specifically in the recruitment phase, but also once neurodiverse people get employed, and we can maybe delve into some of those. And therefore, there's actually quite a large need for training, communication, and understanding about amongst the general population within an organization, but particularly for line managers. And what I also found is that there's a significant overlap between levels of mental well-being issues and neurodiverse people, because they're struggling to, in many cases, be fully supported within an organization. They have higher levels of mental well-being, and given that's such a challenge for organizations currently, there's an intersectionality issue there. And therefore, for all of those reasons, and we can go into a lot more detail shortly, I do think that it's something that boards should be talking about. And whilst, in those two questions, it was fascinating to say that in maybe a third of the organizations are starting to think about it, but nobody said that it had actually reached a board conversation. I think that's a challenge for us, because I think the levels of risk are potentially quite high for boards in a way that they've not thought about as much as they could have done.
Thank you, Ian, and that's fascinating. I mean, I was just thinking if perhaps we had different sectors represented, whether that answer may have been different, and that might be something we can explore later. But if we just coming to the concluding part, the next question, please, Kate, of this short presentation, your thoughts on the implications for boards. I mean, you touched upon the risk aspect, and I guess I'd also be interested in. I think we do have some board members who've spoken very publicly about their own neurodiversity, and so maybe you could also touch on not just the sort of the board oversight, but also actually perhaps the experience of board members themselves who are neurodiverse. Ian.
Yeah, no, that's a very important and interesting point. So yeah, I think starting off on the negative, I think there are risks, especially because I've found evidence, and there's plenty of evidence in other academic research, of a lot of unintended bias and discrimination. And what's been really interesting for me is that the level of employment tribunals in the countries where the stats are available of cases brought about by neurodiverse people is significantly lower than all other forms of diversity. And I think that's a tidal wave that is going to come. And therefore, organizations that don't get ahead of this, you've seen this sort of six-figure sums that can be paid out in terms of gender and ethnicity claims, certainly in the UK. We haven't seen that yet for neurodiversity, and I think that's a real risk going forward. I think, therefore, it needs to be added to for those organizations that aren't including it within their diversity inclusion policies very significantly. But at the same time, I think if you give careful thought and consideration to it, and there are some things that we can do, which we'll come on to in a second, as you say, I think there are also huge opportunities. As I mentioned a bit earlier, it's a talent pool that is underutilized, both the people that you're not yet recruiting, but also within the organization. Quite often, it's very clear from the people I've interviewed that they can't give of their best even though you've recruited them, they're not giving you all of their talents because you're not able to support them currently in the way that they need to be supported. And if you can provide what is often not expensive, it just needs a bit of thought, you get a lot more out of current people. So in terms of improving productivity and creativity, huge opportunity. But also going back to right where I started in terms of that typical bluntness, open speaking, and almost the lack of filter that is quite prevalent amongst some autistic people. What I've also found, and it's evident in other research, is that is a huge risk avoidance element, because autistic people and other neurodiverse people are more typically less likely to fall into groupthink. And if you think about the number of organizational mistakes and errors that occur because everyone follows the emperor's clothes and the leader, and having people that are prepared to say, hold on a minute, actually, I don't get that, and not be dissuaded by the kind of typical peer pressure that comes in a more conventional neurotypical person, but really hold their ground and say, no, I don't get that, is a massive opportunity for some industries and some organizations. So I think there are huge opportunities. And as you said, Gillian, there are some things that we can start doing quite quickly. There are many, in other aspects of diversity, many self-advocates that have become very impactful within individual organizations and across their industries to promote other aspects of diversity. We're only just starting to see that within neurodiversity. It's happening, but only very recently, and in a few examples. I think if you have people that are prepared in organizations to talk about their own neurodiversity, it can make it much more welcoming and much more opening for existing employees. I think within recruitment, it is possible to make significant changes with that very little expense that would make it much more likely that you would attract and then be able to recruit neurodiverse candidates, which brings with it huge opportunities. And there are many existing organizations that facilitate this education and this process, whether it be around advising companies on recruitment or on training or line manager support, or actually providing support for the both the individual and the manager in the workplace, which are really not very expensive because it's not become a commercialized part of diversity like a lot of the rest of diversity has. So it's a huge opportunity to improve an organization's effectiveness if the right steps are taken. So I think it's just at an ideal time for boards to start thinking about this and asking their executives and asking their appropriate diversity people, how are we thinking about this and what can we do to support you bringing this forward?
Thank you. And Ian, could you just comment on, I know you and I had talked previously about board members who are neurodiverse, and there's been some FT coverage, but I think there's been one particularly high profile board member in the UK, but there will be other examples as well. And
sorry to interrupt. There have been actually very few at board level, which is really fascinating. As you say, there's been maybe 2 or 3 I can think of in the last couple of years, and even then, those people who have gone public have done so quite nervously about it, and very much, I think, partly because it's a new area, a new language, but also partly because they are very much at the forefront. They've sort of tipped their toe in the water very gingerly, and waited to see what the reaction would be. And like all kind of new developments, I'm sure in time we'll get more people at board level and in influential and notable positions doing it. But it's actually been interesting that probably the understanding of neurodiversity and the public face of it has come more from kind of other aspects of media than it has from board and positions. There've been a number of TV programs and films that have portrayed neurodiverse characters, and there have been a number of neurodiverse sort of celebrities that have talked more openly about their own situation or managing children. And that probably brought more openness to the conversation about it than actually the number of executives that talked about it. But I've presented at a number of HR conferences over the last couple of years, in person and virtually when required. And it's very obvious, but certainly within the HR community, and I think they reflect the wider organizational community, that there's a growing recognition that this is a topic that we need to do more about. But at the same time, almost all of the attendees are conscious that it's an area that they have the least amount of knowledge about in terms of other aspects of diversity, and therefore they're soaking up the information both that I can provide and the directions I can point them in to find more information, because it's something that people recognise there's an information gap and a training gap within organisations at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to open up to Q&A, and because I know I have a number of questions, and I'm sure you do as well. Let's drop the chart so that we can actually have a little bit more of a face-to-face conversation. Thank you. And if you have I can just about see everybody, but if you could raise your hand and probably raise it on the screen as well, I'm sure I'll pick up the questions. So please do if there are questions. And Maria, you have a question. There we go, followed by Hildegard, followed by Jenny. Maria.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating topic. And I have to admit, it's something not really new, but on the other hand, it is new. And I've got two questions. One question is, could Ian please tell a little bit more about the language aspect? Because autists and people with a neurodiversity use language in a different way. Mm-hmm. So that is something I would like to learn a bit more about. And the second one, when you are in a recruitment process and you would like to get this kind of information from the person who is sitting in front of you, what about privacy? So what kind of questions are you allowed to ask and what kind of questions are you not allowed to ask? So how do you get that information without being too without coming in conflict with privacy aspects?
Yeah, two really important points. Thank you. So the first one, first language, as you say, it's a really interesting area, and a lot of the challenges come from the fact that most neurodiverse conditions, particularly autism, which is the one that probably came first in terms of discussion, but there's lots of others, they kind of, the work in them came from very much a medical background. It was seen as a condition, a problem, a disability, and therefore the language was very much of a kind of medical, psychological type approach, which was often quite kind of almost quite disparaging of the person that suffered from autism or dyslexia or dyspraxia. And what's happened over recent times is it's as autistic people and other neurodiverse people have been getting their own voice, they've been very strongly arguing and advocating that in many cases, although they're happy to be considered by certainly in the UK, the Disability Act provisions and be allowed to get appropriate things, they don't see themselves in the traditional sense disabled or disadvantaged. They see themselves as different, and they recognize that there are things that the way their brain operates might need some support, but they don't want to be seen as a problem. They just want to be seen as someone that thinks differently, operates differently, and therefore, rather than talking about somebody with autism, which is almost like it's a disease, they very much that the general conversational language within the autistic community has moved towards talking about autistic people. It is the way that it's a fundamental part of them. You don't talk about a person being with female gender. They are a woman, and therefore autistic people and other neurodiverse people want to be much more specific about it. But that's kind of a trend. And it's not completely reached the end of that journey. So there are still differences within the overall community. And again, because many of the neurodiverse conditions are similar but overlapping, you also sometimes get a situation where people either self-describe or are described by others as having one situation when actually it might be one of the others, or they might have multiple conditions. So the language can get complicated in that regard. So, but if I sort of link that to your second point, which is whether it's a recruitment situation or just a general point of view where you've got existing employees, my advice would be, and I do a bit of kind of private consulting to organizations who are now starting to think about this, would be to think about what language you would want to use to show that as an organization, you are beginning to understand that the awareness of neurodiversity and that you welcome neurodiverse applicants and candidates and employees, and that you want to be supportive and you're prepared to make reasonable adjustments. And therefore, whether it's in your recruitment literature or in an interview, you don't need to say to someone, are you neurodiverse? What you do is you can say, I mean, we all have to now put a question that says, do you consider yourself to fall within the Disability Act or have a disability? If you just leave it at that, as I said, there's a lot of evidence that people don't disclose neurodiversity, and therefore you won't necessarily capture it. So I would always recommend that on top of that question, you ask as a minimum one further question, which says, irrespective of what you said on the previous one, is there anything else we can do to make your application and your future employment with us work more successfully? If there are any other adjustments or modifications to the way that we recruit or the way that we operate that you'd like to tell us about, we would most welcome you telling us about it. You make it into a positive rather than an accusatory negative kind of situation. But it is still very difficult. And I've, as a HR director, had many challenges where line managers have suspected a person is neurodiverse and the person hasn't disclosed, and the manager's wanting to ask them something. And you have to be quite careful because you don't want to make assumptions about a situation either. So it's that's where external advice can also be useful in terms of how you phrase things.
Thank you. And I think you're also indicating to us that this is our thinking is evolving on this subject as well. Very much so.
Very much so. Yes. Very much so. Yes. And that's where also, as soon as possible, as it becomes clear that you've got people already in the organisation that are neurodiverse, the sooner you can get them on board to support, even if they're not part of recruitment or D&I, if they're prepared to talk about their own requirements and their own situation, and maybe say something in the recruitment literature and maybe advise internally what they have found difficult and what they need help with, that escalates and speeds up the process of improving how internal processes work.
Thank you. We have several more questions. So Hildegard, please.
Question and comment. But first of all, thank you very much. And the thanks go to Julia and to Ian for picking this topic up, because I was, as you said, Ian, soaking up the information. I don't know enough about it. And it's one of the areas where I have the least amount of knowledge. And I realized to think about it as an asset and not as a medical condition. It's really a mindset change. Thank you very much for being so straightforward and for helping us so much with it. I was struck by one of your initial comments when you reported about your first or one of your first encounters with it, and you said you were investigating or being part of a disciplinary measure, and people and maybe even you thought about behavior as inappropriate behavior, blunt, open, not appropriate for the organization. I could immediately relate to it. And I think, and this is the question, it's probably a very fine line to draw, because we sometimes or often right now don't know about neurodiversity and people being part of that group. And there will certainly be inappropriate behavior by people who behave inappropriately, and we need to be able to distinguish, and we cannot somehow tolerate truly inappropriate behavior. So what is your advice to us? How do we deal with it? How do we get more knowledgeable, more certain how to react to it? That is question one, and I've tons of questions, but we'll only pose a second one. Don't we, I mean, you were speaking or are speaking as an HR person, and to many people who are in that function and do P&C now. What about the big topic of performance and performance measurement? I think we will most likely also have to approach it from a totally different angle once we know more about neurodiversity, because our old and trusted tools will most likely not be appropriate for that anymore.
Absolutely. In fact, I was going to say that as part of my answer to your first question, that I have been asked by a couple of organizations to look at their performance management processes and language and forms, and they realized that they were wholly inappropriate in a neurodiverse world. The amount of assumptions we make about a stereotypical, neurotypical expectation, where we set criteria of what we're looking for, particularly if people are going to progress, we often say demonstrates empathy and shows empathy in a certain kind of way. Well, different people, neurodiverse neurodiverse people show empathy in an entirely different way from neurotypical people. It's not that they aren't empathetic, they can't be, but it will look very different. And if you're a line manager that doesn't understand that, you can very easily misunderstand the way that a neurodiverse person might be portraying. So performance management systems, you're absolutely dead right, have to be handled very carefully. And sort of broadening it out to your first point, just in terms of how do you differentiate between inappropriate behavior that's genuinely inappropriate and inappropriate behavior that is a facet of a neurodiverse person? That's really tricky. And actually, I also ended up having a case where I had inappropriate behavior from a neurodiverse person that wasn't about their neurodiversity. It was actually something else. So it is a rich topic. And all I can say is the more you can educate line managers, HR colleagues, even the peers of people that are working with people to be aware of this subject. One of the most impactful things you can do is get someone to come along and talk to the organization in open forums. Perhaps if you have staff networks, and there might be a disability network or one other one that you could piggyback on the back of, and actually just open the topic up. What I have found in the organizations that I've worked in is people start to think, gosh, the person I've been managing, and I've assumed it's just because they're very, very blunt, or they're very, they talk in a rude way. Actually, maybe when I think about it, they've also got all the other facets of maybe an autistic person or something else. And perhaps it's who they are, and I need to understand it better before I jump to conclusions about the way that they're behaving. So I think education of all involved is a really important starting point.
Thank you. And that's a theme that's sort of running through, I think, today's roundtable. Several more questions. I'll ask Jenny, then Joe, and then Ruth. So Jenny.
Thanks, Gillian. Really interesting session. So I wanted to ask a question and share something that other colleagues may find helpful. So the first thing is to share. I think for colleagues who, particularly outside the UK, who may not have seen this, GCHQ have a very, very significant program to support neurodiversity in their workplace for all kinds of reasons, and it's not a recent thing. And so if anybody's looking for information or to see how somebody does it, because they're very public about it, it might be worth going to see what they've got there.
And if I can just dive in, Jenny,
yeah.
I actually use GCHQ as one of my case study organizations. Oh. So they actually have a neurodiverse working plan that incorporates probably 10 or a dozen different things that they're trying to do to support more recruitment and better working conditions for neurodiverse people. And my research was just a part of what they're doing. And it was really, really fascinating, the different things that they were considering to try and educate themselves in this topic.
So that's my share. Glad to have it backed up by an expert. But my question is a bit cheeky, Ian, because I don't want to take away all your consultancy income, but I just wondered if you could kind of tell us, if we're thinking about recruitment processes and thinking about how those might be experienced. I know it's a generalization, yes, because there's so many different types of kind of neurodiversity that could fall within this. Are there kind of a top 3 things either to do or not to do?
Yeah. There's a top 10, but I can give you the top 3 as well. And actually, it's not really cheeky. And although I do some paid work, I'm also very passionate about this subject. So if you go onto my website, which Gillian and I'll send round afterwards, which is called autisminwork.com, I've actually done a few public presentations where I've dealt into specific topics in more detail, and one of them is about recruiting neurodiverse people. So there's actually a half-hour presentation on it in detail. But if I was to pick a few things, just very briefly in the confines of time for today, language is critical. So as I said, quite often we put neurodiverse candidates off with the job description or with the advert before you ever see them. And you don't realize that you're never going to get them, because a very common thing about neurodiverse people is that they take anything that's said to them or anything that's written down more literally than would be a typical neurotypical person's response. So if you put a job description out or an ad that lists 6, 8 or 10 facets that you're looking for, it would be much more common for a neurodiverse person to think, I only have 9 out of 10 of those. I don't have one of them, so I won't apply. So if you are not thoughtful about your job descriptions, your adverts, you will lose your chance to recruit people very early. A second thing is that for some neurodiverse people, not everybody, again, I'm trying not to stereotype, but in the interest of time, give some generalizations. For some neurodiverse people, organizational skills are not their strength, and they can find new places, logistics, things like that very stressful. Much more, I mean, we all find going for an interview stressful at the best of times. If you exaggerate that up by about a factor of 10 for some of these people, if you don't provide very helpful information and make it very easy for them, you might also lose them through the process. I've interviewed quite a lot of neurodiverse people who've withdrawn themselves from processes because they just couldn't cope. You know, a really great example on the positive that one organization does is not only do they send a map of showing exactly where the building is, but they show a photograph of what the building looks like, and then they show a photograph of the receptionist so that they know the friendly face that is going to wait to greet them when they get there. And for that neurodiverse person, that was a massive benefit. And if you think about it, this is one of kind of the overlying things I would put in my summary, but I'll say it now. Everything I've found is that the more you adapt the way you change your processes to be more successful with neurodiverse people, it actually benefits everybody. And the line managers who have learnt to manage neurodiverse people well are actually very successful as managers. In fact, one of my other case study organizations now requires the people that are on their fast track management program to absolutely be given neurodiverse people to manage as part of their development program, because if they can manage that, they're going to become better managers generally. And that's a really interesting thing. And then the third thing, as you said, I was only allowed 3, would be around your actual selection criteria. So both the assessment processes you use, but again, back to the question about performance management, if you have stereotypical assumptions of what you're looking for, you might just miss the real talent because you're looking in the wrong place. And I'll declare an interest in a moment, but what I have found is that many of the current selection tools, particularly assessment tools, are biased against neurodiverse people without us realizing it. I say that very openly, even though I have a part-time role with a company that has developed an assessment tool that isn't biased, so I could be considered to have been slightly cheeky there, but I genuinely believe it because it's the first one I've come across that doesn't make assumptions about what good looks like in terms of must be a team player, must be social interaction, must have this, must have that. For many jobs, we use a standard recruitment process that is inappropriate for the type of job. So can you match the selection process and the selection techniques as close as possible to the role? Microsoft, for example, as a great example, they are extremely neurodiverse switched on. They get people to come in and actually do something that is very specific to the role that they are potentially going to be employed in. And they don't do the interview first. They only interview the people after the scene if they can actually do the job that they're going to be required to do. And by doing it, flipping it round, they don't lose a lot of neurodiverse people that they shouldn't, and they do get more neurodiverse people come through to the next stage of the process.
I did wonder whether Silicon Valley would actually be providing some of the answers here.
They're
wanting to be stereotypical.
I know. Well, there are a number. I've been very fortunate to work with Microsoft a lot, and a number of other organizations in the US, and some of them are so switched on to neurodiversity because they see it as a massive, rich talent pool that has been underutilized. In the UK, the autistic community, as an example, it's the one I know most, but it's probably not quite as bad for some of the other neurodiverse conditions, but the autistic community in the UK, only 16% of them are in full-time employment, and compared to about 66% across the general population. So there's a 50% employment gap there of people that have got talents that as organizations we're missing.
Shocking, absolutely shocking. Jo, and then Ruth, please. Jo.
Thank you, and thank you again for bringing up this topic. I think it's fantastic that we just start the conversation on it. I think, you know, when we talk about recruitment processes, recruitment is all well and good, but if things then fall on their face once they land in an organization, then you've got a real problem, and you go straight back to all of those risk horror stories that you were talking about there. I think one of the things I think would be really important is that we just get the conversation going within companies, that we get the awareness up, that we get the training up. I'm very conscious that even in schools, people are not fully understanding the range of neurodiversity, the language, and so on. Are there any good off-the-shelf training packages that, again, companies can start to incorporate just into their DE&I training, and just starting to, again, socialize the language, so that when these situations come up, disciplinaries, or you identify challenges, you can actually bring it into a language that people are already getting used to? Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right about recruitment just being the first hurdle. But even once recruited, the average job length of neurodiverse people is much shorter than neurotypicals, because so often it then goes wrong once they are recruited. So you're right. It's fabulous if you do recruit them, but it's also really important to do that education and that communication. There are starting to be training programs and training providers. It's not at all as well developed as other areas of diversity, but again, I can put some stuff in the information that Gillian and I'll send out afterwards. There are a few organisations that are now getting into this space and are very much populated by experts and concentrate on the aspects that you need to think about, whether it be line manager training or general employee training. And quite a few of them are prepared to do stuff to begin with at little or no charge, because they're either charities or social enterprises. And there's organizations like Ambitious About Autism, which is a great one, who are actually doing a lot to get companies to trial neurodiverse people in their organization, and they provide support for the individual and the manager and the organization. And by doing kind of internships and training programs with people, it's a kind of chance for all parties to learn about this process. And because they provide that professional support, many organizations are using someone like them to get themselves much better educated and up the learning curve in this area.
Thank you. And we will send around details, as Ian says. Ruth.
Okay, thanks, Gillian. Ian, let me also say that was just really interesting. So thank you very much. And I think I'm going to sort of jump straight into the hot water here.
Go on, then.
So with all the problems about not knowing what's okay and what's not okay, and what can you talk about and what can't you talk about, because it is a new topic. So I'll ask for forgiveness. I'll also say that I have two lovely grandsons who are definitely both on the autism spectrum. So I have a really personal interest in thinking about what their future will be like, and how the workplace will develop by the time they go into it. But my question is just reflecting on all that you said, and thinking about the different diversity angles that Gillian talked about in her introduction. And I think it's probably true that in all the others, or most of the others, we have bit by bit sort of pushed our way to the realization that the underrepresented or diverse group could actually do any of the things that the majority group can do and does. So we've sort of moved away from roles that women can really do to, it being accepted that women can do all of those roles. And I think that would be true of ethnic diversity and so on and so on. And I just wonder, I'd love to hear from you, who have obviously sort of immersed yourself in this as an issue much more than certainly I have. Where do you think that gets to in the workplace with neurodiversity? Because you've talked very clearly, and I completely understand the points around, not presuming that you need social skills or teamwork or empathy to be manifested in the ways we're all used to for all roles. But I mean, instinctively, until we get an awful lot further as a society and understanding these differences, it seems to me we will still have roles which are very, very dependent on EQ and putting yourself in others' shoes and so on and so on. So I just wonder how you look at that, and then with an HR organization, how you would be thinking about developing the organization for the future.
Yeah, really great question. And it's actually, I asked that question directly as part of my research to all the autistic and neurodiverse candidates I spoke to, and also their employers. and I got a fascinating range of responses. Even those organisations that are neurodiverse, thoughtful, and have been doing things like recruit people and have got programs, nearly all of them started off from a presumption that there will be certain jobs and certain professions that would more naturally lend themselves to people that were neurodiverse. And actually, there are more examples. When Gillian talked about the people that have self-disclosed publicly, within certain fields, whether it be engineering, law, IT, there are certain professions where there are clearly more examples of people that have declared their neurodiversity. And so I think, like the other things that you talked about, we are going through a typical developmental curve in terms of our understanding, both at an organizational level and at a societal level. Unfortunately, for a lot of the last 30 years, society's view of neurodiversity was determined by Dustin Hoffman portraying Rain Man, and that was almost most people's view of what the neurodiversity looked like. It's only latterly that the range and complexity and nuance of this subject has become better understood. But what I was finding towards the end of my research was a number of neurodiverse people that were very clear with me and said, I'm not typical of a neurodiverse person. I had one lady who was an extroverted marketer who was also autistic, and a couple of other people that said, why wouldn't I be a really good line manager? Because most of the failings of line managers are actually because they're not precise. They don't give people very clear expectations. They're not really clear about timescales and wording and terminology. I'd be very good at all of that. You might actually find that I would be a better manager than most of the neurotypical people who actually, there's almost a growing view amongst the neurodiverse people that it's the neurotypicals that are actually the people with the problems. And actually, if everybody thought and worked the way that they did, organizations would be more effective. So I think we may get to a point, and I think we're probably some time from it yet, where we will break down barriers, and it won't be a question of, yes, the IT people is where a person gets sent, and, you know, whether it be current children or grandchildren that are going through the education system and being pointed quite often by careers people that have very little understanding of all of this, and therefore given not the best advice. I think in 10, 20 years, you will find neurodiverse people in all aspects of life and work.
Thank you. I mean, we're really going through sort of quite a transformation, and a great question, Ruth. And I think also that personal connectivity, it would be quite interesting. I think many of us have that sort of personal connectivity, and it's, you know, it is a really important subject. I also learnt neurotypical is the neurotypicals is a phrase that I think we've probably all become more familiar with on this webinar. We are running short time. I will take all the questions. We've got 3 more, and Jeff, if and then Christopher, and then Mary. Jeff.
Thanks, Jane. Fascinating stuff, Ian. I was just curious about whether you've got any case studies or examples of where you've actually got a neurodiverse team in the majority, so where the neurotypical people were in the minority, and if there's any experience around that. That was then also leading to my second question, which was examples of who organizations or case studies where they've done this really well and leveraged the value of it.
Mm-hmm. So conscious very quickly of time, so I'll give you brief details. I don't know about a majority, but when I worked at Network Rail, we had a department that was responsible for train timetable planning, and it was managing a huge amount of data and trying to make sure that basically 20,000 trains didn't crash into each other on any given day. And as I started promoting this subject, the line manager came to me of that department and said, a large proportion of our team are neurodiverse. Can we change our recruitment process? Because they are the best people at this, and we want to get more and more neurodiverse people into this function. We don't want a job ad that says we want interpersonal skills and social skills. I want people that are not distracted, don't get interrupted, and just concentrate on the data. We do not want 2 trains running into each other. So I think you will find in certain areas almost unintentionally, that there are some areas where there are higher proportions currently of neurodiverse people. Sorry, I forgot the second question. What was it?
Good examples. Other
good examples. Interestingly, the good examples do exist, and they are in all sorts of different places. If you look at, there's a conference that happens every year in the US called Autism in Work, and it's hosted by Microsoft, but there are 6 organizations that work with them, including Hewlett-Packard, Ford, SAP, and those 6 organizations are probably the ones that have done the most to think about neurodiversity in the workplace. But the last time I attended, which was just before we went into lockdown, we did one during lockdown, there's now over 200 organizations globally signed up for that summit, and all of them are sharing their information in terms of best practice. They're not seeing it as something that they want to gain competitive advantage for. It was fabulous to see competitors giving each other information in terms of how they were handling it better. So find ways to tap into that website and that organization and those organizations. And there are loads of great examples. And as I say, if you want to go on, if you go onto Microsoft, they've got a fabulous disability website, but even within the disability side, they've got a section within autism and neurodiversity, which is really, really fascinating, including case studies and interviews with neurodiverse people talking about why they love working for Microsoft.
Thank you. Clearly, Microsoft has played a leading role here.
They've impressed me.
Thank you. Two outstanding questions. Christopher.
A very quick comment and 2 questions. When I used to run Thomas Cook, we put together the Thomas Cook Continental Rail timetable. We had the same group of people that were called puffernuts. They loved it. Now, 2 questions. Have you seen in any of the research you've done behavioral differences by nationality? I'm conscious of having had a couple of Norwegian board members who engage in a completely different way and are slightly closer to the lady in the bridge than you might normally expect in a British example, very productively. The second thing is, have you looked at arts organizations? Because chairing arts organizations, I see this all the time.
Yeah, so the second question first, not so much. I have dealt with a couple of charities, but not specifically art. So that's probably a gap in terms of things where I can give you a lot of insight. But in terms of the first one, in terms of nationalities and particularly cultures, there is definitely actually 2 big things going on, which are really fascinating. I think it's quite recognized that there are different cultural approaches to work globally anyway. If you haven't come across the work of Hofstede and some others, there are definitely different ways that different cultures operate in work. What's also true is that different countries and different cultures in different parts of the world have approached diversity in different ways. And neurodiversity, and if I use autism in particular to begin with, because that's the one I know most about, has currently not yet been accepted as a recognized thing in some countries and some cultures. So the organization's ability to look after and think about neurodiversity in some countries and some cultures is currently quite a way behind other countries and other cultures. At the moment, I don't know for what reason, but the typical Anglo-Saxon countries are the ones where the most work and the most research has been done. So the 4 countries where there's the most progress is the US, Canada, the UK, and Australia. And most of the companies that have done stuff in this area so far have come from that. There are some notable exceptions. I mentioned SAP and some others, but if you look at it on as a generalization, and it's more slowly progressing into other countries and other cultures. So that does bring in challenges, particularly for multinational organizations who try and share best practice. It's another challenge to think about how you will do that. And one of my case studies was in a multinational company, and they were really struggling. Some countries and cultures were really grabbing the opportunity that the centre was providing, and some countries and some cultures just didn't understand the language at all.
That's interesting. I mean, we've seen in other aspects of diversity big differences sort of culturally, but I can see that actually not recognizing that people are different and neurodiversity is the first step hasn't been taken really. We have a final question from Mary. And I can see people are dropping off, so Mary,
yeah,
please.
I'll be quick. Thank you very much, and Ian, so thought-provoking and important too. Two things. Could you tease out whether or not there's anything helpful in breaking neurodiversity down a little bit into, and again, I'm generalizing horribly, two broad groups, one more around the autism spectrum, one more perhaps around the information processing, dyslexia, calcula, dyspraxia, and so on, or in the end, does the umbrella approach work? And secondly, could you say something about the interaction with gender? At the moment, we see different distribution curves, especially on the autism spectrum, and some of the stereotypical attributes are deemed to be more stereotypically male. Equally, it's only now that a lot of women are beginning to come forward and finally be diagnosed, so it's complex. But again, is there anything that you've observed there that worth thinking about?
Yeah. So very quickly, first one, yes, I think there is a significant advantage in separating neurodiversity out into its elements as you get to think about it. It obviously brings more challenge to an organization because there's more things to think about. But some people, for example, there are, like with dyslexic people, I've learned that there are massive amounts of dyslexic specific software that's available that can really help people on that particular facet, as I think there are. So in the UK, there's a dyslexic organization, a dyspraxia organization, and a dyscalculia organization that all provide tools and equipment on their own websites. So as you get into this, recognizing that there are different places to go is useful, but it's obviously, it just adds to the things you have to think about. In terms of women and gender, I very much found that there was an intersectionality challenge here. As you say, historically, actually going back to autism in particular, and I think it's also true somewhat of dyslexia, they were seen as almost male-only conditions for a long time. And all the early research talked about young boys. Because, and again, you have to be careful here because some people get a bit sensitive, but typically the way most girls interact as children in school is they operate in a different way from boys. They mimic people around them and actually end up developing social skills in a different way from the way boys do. So if they are autistic or neurodiverse, they can get away with not being spotted because they're actually copying people around them. Whereas typically young boys have been proven to not do that. So if they are a bit different in terms of the way that they cognitively operate, it stands out more. So historically, women were not diagnosed as early in their lives as men. And therefore, I interviewed quite a few women who were in the workplace and felt that they were doubly disadvantaged because they were suffering challenges around gender, but also because their neurodiversity was underreported and not recognized, and their masking and camouflaging skills meant that their managers didn't realize they were neurodiverse. They weren't getting some of the support that was available. So I think as you get into this, one of the things I've been promoting with some of the organizations I'm talking to is to think really carefully about that, because some of the reasons you might be having gender issues is because some of the women are neurodiverse and you're really not supporting them.
Thank you. The complexity of intersectionality is enormous, but the potential as well, the potential. Yep. Thank you. I am going to have to draw to a close. I wonder if we could just flip back to the charts, please, Kate. And thank you very much, Ian, for taking us through a huge amount of territory. We will be as I say, sharing the material and some of the follow-up. We've just wrapped up, really. This is a subject that's beginning to certainly belongs on the company's agenda, and I think potentially on the board's agenda as well. Multifaceted, and really the need to sort of think through from the risk perspective, but also the opportunity perspective. And we'd just like to leave you with those thoughts. Are your boards asking the right questions, receiving good data, and listening and understanding? So thank you, Ian. And just looking ahead briefly to our next webinars, then later this month, next month, the board and the future of work. Then picking up on Mary and Maria's discussion, Germany's geopolitical reorientation, which will be next month. And then we'll be kicking off a small group of chairs and employee engagement, what effective looks like, in June. And that will be in person, which we're very much looking forward to. So I'd like to say thank you to all of you for joining today and for the extremely good and open questions. Thank you very much to Ian, who's really shared very generously your time, your insights, and also been advising Fidelio on this subject. So thank you very much for that, Ian. And we'll share, as I say, the material afterwards. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. And it was a great discussion. We really appreciated it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.